This is an FPV Cinewhoop drone, and that was me desperately trying to make it fly. And if you've never built a drone before, you might want to learn from my mistakes. The plan was simple. I bought all the pieces for this pre-built drone, and if I watch enough generic YouTube tutorials, I could easily piece it together, right? But what I didn't know is this would be the most frustrating and exhausting video I would ever attempt. But first, let's try to put the frame together. And in case you're wondering, this is the ELRS Receiver 35 V2 frame kit. I'll talk about the other parts when they become relevant. First I watched Joshua Bardwell build a 5-inch freestyle drone, which didn't help, and then I found a video repairing this exact quad, which was better. I finally figured out how the top plate went with the prop guards, so I tried screwing them together, but there was nothing to screw into. Okay, this is really confusing. Until
there are some standoffs, 4 of them.
Yeah, that might help. So I got the top and bottom plates screwed onto the prop guards by the standoff, put all the motor wire holders on, then squished all the motor wires through and screwed all the motors on. And that was kinda dumb, because right then I realized I have to undo basically everything. I took the prop guards off and figured out how my flight controller was positioned. The motors I'm using are from ELRS, the SpeedX2 2105.5 2650 kV. I measured the motor wire lengths and cut them all to length, which is where I ran into my first roadblock. Soldering, however you pronounce it. I'd already done several hours of practice, but I still wanted to do more. Better safe than sorry.
This is a soldering iron I got. Secure D60B.
I already tinned all the pads on the practice board, so I practiced soldering wires to them. First you tin the exposed end of the wire and hold it over the pad, heat it all up and melt it together. With increased soldering confidence, I was ready for the flight controller. It's the F722 45 amps all-in-one V2, which is in the pre-built drone. I decided to do the capacitor first as that was lower risk. I wrapped the capacitor prongs around my wire and then put solder all through it. And when I finally soldered the other ends to the flight controller, it looked like this. I was very happy. From now on, I'm going to shorten flight controller to just FC. It takes too long to say. I screwed the FC into the frame and prepared to solder the motors to it. This might sound surprising to you because usually you solder motors to the ESC, right? This FC is an all-in-one, flight controller and engine speed controller in the same board. You might be thinking, that's great, but it's gonna make my life very hard soon. On an ESC, you get these flat, massive pads for the motor wires, but in this all-in-one, the most surface area is on the side, and a little bit on top as processors dangerously close. Not fun at all. I managed to tin all the motor pads, tried soldering a motor wire on, but couldn't do it even after several attempts. This brings us to the end of day 1.
Good morning. So, what was I doing?
Day 2. I pulled all the motors off for soldering because that was easier than on the frame, and labelled each to where it belonged. As I mentioned earlier, the motor pads on this FC are a pain, and this is where I started to feel that pain. After 25 minutes, I got one motor soldered on. Barely. They'll do the job, who cares? And in the next 45 minutes, I soldered all the motors on. After I got the all clear from the FPV dentist, I was mounting the FC to the frame when a motor wire popped off. Must have been a cold joint. 1 minute fix, and this time it works.
I think I'm going to connect the power cables next. No! Capacitor wire came off. Not good. Not good. Well, I guess it's going to have to go on top.
I soldered the positive power cable on and then soldered the positive capacitor wire on top of that. Problem solved, but a much bigger problem lay waiting for me. The negative power supply. I only have negative things to say about it. I set my soldering iron to the maximum temperature, but the solder still wasn't melting. I would apply heat until the wire was too hot to touch, let it cool down and repeat, but it just wasn't working. Eventually it stayed on and I thought it would work, but little did I know that it would come back to haunt me. This receiver is a Happy Metal EP1 RX with the Express LRS protocol. After 5 minutes of Joshua Bardwell, I figured out what each pad was and wired the receiver up. Then I tinned the pads for UAVfutures and the FC, soldered the receiver to it, and pulled off all the tape, so I could start on the camera system. I chose to go digital for this build with the DJI-03 Air unit. Apparently it's close to a GoPro in quality, that's nice. But I wanted to do a smoke test before I put the camera unit on, because it was by far the most expensive piece of kit. First step in a smoke test, use a multimeter to check for continuity between negative and positive. At first I was worried that the beep went on for too long, but it was just the capacitor charging up. Then it stopped and didn't beep at all. I checked that ground was set up right and everything was all clear. It's time to plug a battery in.
This has got to be the single most scary part of the entire build. The multimeter test seemed good, so let's do it. My heart is absolutely racing right now. Okay, how does this go in? Something like this. Yes! Look at it! It's flashing. Perfect. It works! Yes! You don't know what that's like until you've done it yourself. I just gotta sit here for a bit. Overcome the shock. Whew, that's amazing.
Now I can do the O3 air unit. I figured out how the bottom plate holds the air unit and plugged the fancy connector to the FC. I found the plastic holder for the air unit antenna because the antenna was too short. Apparently GearPassy knew this because there was 3 UFL connectors in the frame kit. I took off the air unit and carefully popped off the UFL connectors. Now the antenna should be plenty long. Actually, way too long. I fiddled with it for so long that I managed to break the end of the extender wire, and to make things worse, I had to quit for the day right then. Day 3. This is taking longer than I expected. Alright, so back to the antenna problem. I had to take the air unit back off and replace the damaged video wire extender. I also used some heat shrink to keep the joint safe between the original antenna wire and the extender. I was pretty happy with how it turned out. If I can just get the ELRS receiver secured, I'm basically done. I heat shinked the receiver, and because of the extra height, it couldn't fit in the plastic holder. I've got a solution though: zip ties! They're way too big, but I used them anyway. Squeezing the gummies in for the camera was kinda hard. I screwed the O3 camera into the 3D printed holder, and yeah, I had to take it off again to put the gummies on.
How many times have I done that in this build so far? A lot.
And the gummies were such a tight fit, it took me just over 20 minutes to convince them to do their job, and then I could finally put the camera back in. The GoPro mount gummies were so much easier to squish in, it only took me 1 minute. Before binding the goggles to the air unit, I finished up some minor details such as securing the receiver antenna, routing the camera cable so it doesn't get cut, and installing the brackets for the battery strap. The app for DJI stuff wasn't available for Linux, so I had to move to a different computer. I got all the firmware updated, but kinda hit a wall trying to push the bind button on the air unit. I tried Allen keys and solder wire with no success, till finally I found a paper clip, which worked after a few tries. And after a few minutes, it all worked.
We got it. That's what it looks like in there. Oh, that is strange. That is too strange. But it works, so yay. I'm very happy.
I unscrewed the bottom plate, and then the prop guards could slide on. I finally got the prop guards on, screwed all the motors in, and stuck the battery pads on. It's really looking like a finished drone, but we're not done yet. Day 4. The challenge for today is figuring out how to use Express LRS. Apparently, it's really complicated, and straight away, I ran into a huge problem. I plugged the battery in and the receiver was solid green, not flashing. I waited 60 seconds and it still wouldn't go into Wi-Fi mode. I tried power cycling it 3 times to go into binding mode, but still, the receiver was solid green. It just wasn't working, so I configured all the firmware on my transmitter instead. But when that was done, I had no choice but get the receiver to work. I decided to plug the quad into Betaflight to see if there was something wrong there, but Betaflight wasn't even picking up the FC. I eventually used a different cable and then Betaflight worked. And I then noticed the receiver worked normally when the drone was powered by USB. It went into Wi-Fi mode and I was able to update and configure the ELRS firmware and get the controller bound to the drone. Day 5 was Sabbath, so I could only work in the evening. I set up all the switches on the receiver tab and got the OSD overlay set up. Day 6. I used some duct tape to hold down the camera cable, however, I do not recommend doing that as the cable got cut only a few weeks later. I screwed in some extra standoffs I had forgotten, figured out how to put the props on.
That should make it go on. So that one definitely goes here.
Screwed all the props on, and stuck on the battery strap.
Like that. And that. That's pretty solid. Before I go fly in real life, I'm just going to practice in the simulator real quick because I haven't practiced in a few weeks.
I spent about half an hour on the liftoff simulator and then powered the drone on with USB so the controller would connect, then put a battery on and went outside. And it wouldn't arm, so I turned it on with USB again and it worked. Sort of.
Probably propellers put on wrong or something.
I took the props off to check the motor spin directions and they're all spinning backwards. That explains the violent jumping. I quickly sorted that out and went out again. I sort of hovered, but a tiny bump from the ground and it would lose power.
Telemetry lost.
This happened again and again. So, back to the workbench. I had to unscrew nearly everything to get the prop guards off, and then to my shock horror, I found the negative power cable was loose. It was a cold joint. Remember earlier when I said the negative power supply would come back to haunt me? It had me now, and would continue to get me. While I had the drone open, I wired up a 90 decibel buzzer, in case I lose this one day, started the negative power supply back on, and switched the ELRS receiver to a different UI. Day 7. I superglued the buzzer to the frame and left it for a few hours. It looked crazy when it set, but what made me very happy was that I could now connect the controller to the drone without needing USB power. It turned out that the O3 air unit uses UART1 for video and UART2 for the DJI controller, so it was messing with the voltages for the ELRS receiver. The solution was just solder it to a different UART. I quickly reassembled everything and headed out again. And this time, a motor wasn't working. Day 8. I pulled it apart and could clearly see a motor wire had unsoldered itself. I soldered it back on and reassembled the quad. Hopefully, this is it. We'll see. Now let's put the goggles on. Still fine. It took a lot more throttle than I expected and was really loud. Is it raining? Okay, go pick it up. It flew but took over 50% throttle to hover, so when I did a flip, it had no power to recover, and it lost power the second it hit the ground. That was, it's not powering on anymore. Shouldn't do a flip on like your first flight. We'll get there one day. Building your own is hard. Alright, what in the world is wrong? Every time I go for a test flight, something goes wrong and breaks. I took it all apart again, and yep, that pesky negative power cable again. I soldered it back on, giving it plenty of heat, and reassembled everything, only to find the ground wire for the receiver had come off due to all the heat from the power cable. I managed to solder it back on with only one prop guard off and then put it back together. I flew several batteries but only got 1 minute of flight time each, apart from it being wildly inefficient. After some scrolling on Reddit, it turns out it does matter if you put your props on upside down. The pitch is the same, but it curves differently. So after putting props on the right side up, I went for the second to last test flight, and it was so much better. It was quieter, faster, and it flew for a whole 6 minutes. I then stuck a GoPro on and it handled the weight really well. Plus the footage is just phenomenal. So as a first drone, building a Cinewhoop was a bad idea. I would have been a lot better off going with like a 5-inch or something, because there's a lot more open room and space to do your work. If you want to build your first drone, please don't try and build a Cinewhoop. I wouldn't recommend trying to build something like this. Just get it by and fly, honestly.
Why build a Cinewhoop? No point.
If for some reason you do want to build this, there's links in the description, as well as links to the pre-built drone as well. They are affiliate links, so please use them, because then I get just a tiny bit of money, because I'm broke. If you like this video, YouTube thinks you might like this one too. So, go ahead and watch it. Please.